Go to our panel. David Korn, Mother Jones Washington bureau chief and MSNBC contributor. Niall Stanage, the Hill White House columnist. Former Florida Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo, and Danya Perry, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Thank you all four. And Niall. So the messaging we heard on the Sundays, if you're on the left, you're saying the right's not listening. If you're on the right, the left is not listening. Is there any way that Chairman Nadler can move this more towards the middle of the aisle, the middle of the space, and say, no, we actually are trying to do something that is fair and going down the middle?
Well, the question presumes that the middle still exists in American politics, and that is pretty questionable these days. Now, I do think that Chairman Nadler has a lot of evidence to marshal. He can make a very, very strong argument. But when we look at what President Trump and his allies are doing in response, it's simply not engaging in evidence or not seeking to appeal to the middle ground. Look, what President Trump and his propagandists have been engaged in is an assault on the idea that these facts exist or that there is valid grounds for impeachment. President Trump talks about the famous transcript of the call being perfect. Well, it's not, but he is engaged in an effort to inflame his supporters, to delegitimize this investigation. And that is the entire focus of the effort, not just from him, but from his allies in Congress and his allies in the media.
You know, David, if there is no middle here, then let's talk about what House Speaker Pelosi might do here. She leads the Democrats in the House. Kristen Welker, a White House correspondent, was speaking to sources relevant to what Speaker Pelosi might be inputting into this process. Those sources saying, consider holding the articles once they've been passed. Why might that make sense?
Well, it makes sense because, as Niall just very ably explained, the whole strategy from Trump and the Republicans is to not only ignore the truth of the realities, but to create alternative narratives. Mark Meadows, one of the House Republicans defending Trump, was on the show this morning, and he was asked, well, is it wrong for Trump to ask in a call in the transcript that came out for another country to investigate a potential rival? And he said that didn't happen. Well, actually, it did happen. So we're at this point where Trump and his cult members are denying any of the even basic facts here. So the problem is, if the Democrats pass articles of impeachment this week, next week, or before Christmas, and then they hand it over to the Senate, who controls the Senate? The Republicans. They can really run to town and turn a trial, an impeachment trial, perhaps into an investigation of Joe Biden and Burisma and Hunter and Ukraine meddling and all these things that aren't important, aren't center here, that don't even exist. And the Democrats will lose control of the factual narratives. That's one reason to maybe pass articles of impeachment, but not hand the story over to people who have denied basic elements of it.
And one part of the elements that might be introduced if you hold the articles as you wait for a potential trial, Danya, is that there's a question of what federal judges will decide when it comes to the decision, do I answer the congressional subpoena, or do I listen to what the White House is saying about executive privilege? That, of course, affects Mick Mulvaney. That affects John Bolton, Kupperman, and others. That's a potential reason to wait.
That's a good potential reason to wait. The law is pretty clear in this. There's not a lot of precedent, but to the extent there is, the law is on the side of the Democrats here. And you've heard a lot of rhetoric from the Republicans about how rushed the process is and how we don't have firsthand testimony from many of the relevant witnesses. And so the law is on the side of the Democrats, and the facts very likely will be from the second-hand testimony, and in some cases firsthand, that we've heard from other witnesses. So certainly that could play to the Democrats' favor, putting aside, of course, the timing and political issues that they will face given the delays that will be, occasioned or necessarily a part of the process for the court to hear the cases out.
Representative Curbelo, yesterday, some of the guests on the show were saying this is cast. We're done on left and right in the House. This is just done, right? And so as you look forward to the next step, maybe Democrats are saying we are going to move full steam ahead because there is no possibility of finding, as what Niall was saying, may not exist, that middle ground.
Well, there's one more inflection point for Nancy Pelosi. I do believe the Judiciary Committee will proceed, will pass articles of impeachment, but whether or not they make it to the floor before the end of the year, that is certainly an open question. And it's true, there isn't a middle on whether or not the president should be removed from office. The country is about split evenly on that question. However, approximately 70% of Americans do believe that the president did something wrong or inappropriate. And I think Nancy Pelosi has an opportunity to appeal to that 70% by deferring this question of impeachment, unless, of course, there's new testimony that really pushes another 10, 20% of the American public. But in absence of that, Nancy Pelosi has the opportunity to defer to the American people and to say, this question will be answered in November of 2020. I think a lot of Americans, especially Americans in the middle, will feel empowered by that decision, will take some ownership of their democracy, and will probably take the 2020 election a lot more seriously than they would otherwise.
I want to go back to what was mentioned earlier, and that is Rudy Giuliani getting into the conversation again. This brought up by the president, Rudy Giuliani, also responding to that and saying all my conversations are privileged and he can disclose what he is comfortable with. I am in process of still analyzing what I received. Niall, when you think maybe Rudy Giuliani may not be part of the conversation, the hand goes up in the air.
Rudy Giuliani is not testifying under oath. I would put all my paltry life savings on that outcome. I don't think that that is any realistic possibility. I know the president was talking up the idea, but look, Rudy Giuliani often makes it up as he goes along. I mean, let's be candid about that. So the idea of doing that under penalty of perjury seems extraordinarily unlikely to me. He's clearly, been running this shadow foreign policy, if you want to call it that. He's clearly involved in a lot of pretty murky business in Ukraine. But the idea that he's going to come back with some report that blows the Democratic case apart, I think that's an absurd contention that's made entirely for political reasons.
And as they ruminate about all of this, for the Democrats here, Danya, Adam Schiff, chair of the Intel Committee, said today on the Sundays, if I were going through this, I might focus on the articles of impeachment that have the strongest case to be made. Yet when you go through the 55-page report that came out yesterday, it seems to leave a lot of open space in terms of the potential articles of impeachment that will be considered. Mueller also part of that, and that could be a third rail for some.
Yeah, there's definitely an openness as to whether or not the Mueller piece will be a part of the articles of impeachment. Clearly, there's consensus that the strong evidence at this point is with respect to the Ukraine investigation and the obstruction of Congress and of justice. But there's an openness, and certainly it will be part of the backdrop. It will be part of the context in terms of there's a pattern here of election interference and the specter that this will happen again in the 2020 elections.
Okay. Niall Standage, Danya Perry, thank you. Have a great Sunday. Congressman Corbello, David Corn, we'll see you in just a little bit.